where was somebody, who were they near, how long were they near them, like really important questions for understanding exposure risk. And most people carry a phone with them nowadays. Like you have a higher chance of having your phone on you than you might have on having your wallet on you, or a purse. And so that reality of people having the phone with them gives you a good tool of something that is always on and always able to track in real time, if you will, what exposure might be, and then a way to centralize that. So you can really automate much of the things that before were either manual and human memory prone, turn into computer memory and computer automation. So there's lots of technological benefits to that, but then there's obviously implications to that, and I'll let Lauren take it from there.
Yeah, on the implications front, so my spidey sense as a privacy attorney is just tingling. So I think the technology in general doesn't contradict privacy or laws per se. It's how it's implemented and it's how it's used that really is where the questions come in. So from a fundamental level, I'm not aware of any jurisdiction outright that would just say, no, you can't do this. It's more about the safeguards and the protections and the formatting. And those come in a variety of fashions. That is state-based or industry-based privacy laws. That's focusing on the US. There are obviously national and more broad geography laws, such as in the EU, that will apply to this. There are also considerations from sector-specific laws. So looking at healthcare, if this is going to pass data between entities that would be covered by HIPAA, for example, so if you're getting data directly from a doctor's office in order to populate the test there, in order to populate the technology to reach out to persons, that would then potentially have implications under HIPAA. So there are a variety of different ways that this is impacted. And then of course, there's the security levels in there as well, which we'll get to later, addressing the fact that privacy and security, I always view them as a Venn diagram. They have their own independent parts of the bubble, but there's a lot of overlap there as well. And the security aspect is imperative for a lot of the privacy laws as well. So whether it's breaches or whether it's just providing reasonable security, there are considerations there as well. And some technologies are not as infallible as others.
Thank you so much. And that is a really good overview. We're going to have a slide that we talk a little bit more in detail about the EU policy side of this. Obviously, we can have a long conversation just on the policy side, but we're going to kind of balance the presentation here and talk a little bit more also on the technical side, since we have been with that. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what is it that you really need. Like if you want a cell phone to do some form of digital contact tracing, right? What is the minimum data that you will need to make that actually function, Ben?
Yep, and just a comment for folks on, we will do questions at the end as well as live questions. So if you have a question on something we just said, please feel free to drop that into the chat or into the questions section, and we'll answer it there. If it's a generic question, we'll follow it up at the end. But for this, like the fundamental is like you need to know location, and there's generally two ways of knowing location. There's an absolute perspective and a relative perspective. So like if you want to know where in the world are you, that's an absolute location. Or is it really relative location? It doesn't really matter where I am. I could be in any particular state. It matters where relative to maybe another person who is sick, I happen to be. And that's really the more critical one. It's also less invasive, if you will, in terms of how much data is provided when it's a relative signal. And then the other two pieces is obviously time. You have to know when did that occur. And then the last one is having some sort of identifier. Lots of different ways to tackle identifiers, like obviously names and addresses, and there's various, like, either your fingerprints or device fingerprint are all ways to get at that identifier. But if you have that combination of things, then something like contact tracing can be assembled. And there's a lot of like levels of granularity, a lot of choices in here about what granularity of time, what level of location resolution, what type of identifier, is it permanent, is it temporary? All of those things then have different implications, both for how good can your contact tracing be, as well as might be like the privacy implications or potential overreach, depending on how that's been used.
Thank you so much. And obviously this is kind of the core, right? The location, the unique identifier, and a timestamp. But depending on the implementation, some implementations might take a lot more data. So what is additional that some of these implementations that we see globally are using and feeding into their digital contact tracing technology. I think that's the next slide.
Oh, yeah. Also, as we had two questions as well that I think made sense here. One was devices may be also shared between family or friends. Will this reduce the effectiveness and accuracy of contact tracing? I don't know if Lydia or Lauren want to comment on that, or I can.
I think that's an interesting one. I think it depends, because if you're around those people, so for example, if you're thinking of it from the perspective of a parent passing the device to a kid, which is to me what I think of when I think of someone sharing a device, in that instance, there might be more of a proximity, not necessarily, but there might be. On the inverse side, if it's a situation where you have, I don't know, a family iPad, mom and dad share an iPad, for example, and so one person might be taking it with them on a given day and then someone else might not. To that end, I think that there is a possibility. I'm not sure that there's necessarily a way around that. Ben, I'm not sure from a technical perspective if user IDs on their own could circumvent that, because I don't think it necessarily would, but I'd welcome your perspective there.
Yeah, on the whole, like there are some things that phones could be doing. I'm not aware of anybody currently doing this, but like for phones that do have facial recognition as an authentication means, like there's type of checks you could do there. The same thing for like other biometric signals that you could be using to detect like freshness of the signal and sharpen it up a little bit. I suspect you kind of get in diminishing returns. Not a scientist, but I suspect you kind of get diminishing returns in that. Even if it was, say, my son who you were exposed to, as opposed to me, I suspect that's still something you want to know about, even though it may have a little bit more error in it. And there's a lot of error in all of these systems, like where just like glancing passes at the maximum range of Bluetooth might trigger. And yeah, it's a little bit of like maybe a false positive, but it's still probably better than the alternative of having no signal at all.
Right, that's a really good question. I haven't seen any studies on this, but I tend to agree with both Ben and Lauren in terms of just logic, right? The sharing of the device typically happens in the household, inside your house. When people walk out the street, they typically walk with their cell phone, and it's not common that your personal cell phone is something that you will give to somebody else to carry around. So there might be less influence that we think, but I haven't seen any study, and it's a good question. Did we have another question, or do we want to talk about?
There are two more questions, but I think that we will get to one of them and we can have one at the end.
Sure.
So let's keep going with the slides, I guess.
Okay, so Ben, this is the question for you, right? Like, if we want more data, right? If we want more data because we want, better tracing, how many other elements of data? I guess the question is infinite, but what are the typical elements that might be added to enhance these kinds of technologies depending on the policy and the specific?
So a number of governments have this take different positions of how comprehensive a solution they're looking to build. And so if you have more of a government organized contact tracing strategy, like they might tie it to government IDs and things like that, so that you can have people come to homes and do even a more formal interview. Like if you believe you have a super spreader, because they can see that in the data suddenly, they can go and talk to that person and like make sure that they're aware of their current status. So like there's a bit more high touch as an opportunity in those systems, but obviously like there's a lot more implication to those types of systems. And so like the bare minimum that we talked about before is really for a more like ad hoc, like helping individuals on a peer-to-peer basis understand, have I been exposed, as opposed to necessarily enabling a more centralized solution. But when you look at the centralized solutions, which again have pros and cons to them, these are the types of things on the screen like that we've seen being added to those systems.
And it's not here, but even CCTV camera feeds in some countries, I think South Korea is using that to identify who was where, and financial data to see, where did you use your credit card. But we have a really good example of a very invasive privacy, from a privacy perspective, technology in the next slide. And to nobody's surprise, it is related to China, which already has taken a centralized approach to surveillance outside of this situation. And now they're just enhancing it because of their need to control the pandemic. So this is from an article in the New York Times about how China has been fighting the coronavirus. The picture secure code inside the Alipay app. And it seems that this sends information to the police when you are using it, which is required. It limits your ability to travel, etc. So I know we have a lot of content, and this is, a fascinating question for a privacy geek like the three of us, but we're going to move on to the policy side. So kind of the other side of this stream, right? We have China being very, very aggressive in terms of decentralizing information. And we have the EU that has a very long tradition of policies that restrict this kind of behavior because of the history of Europe. So Lauren, can you talk a little bit about these guidelines that we have seen? And I know we have seen multiple versions of it from different data protection authorities, but the EDPP is kind of a summary of all of them. I'm asking the impossible, right? Can you in 2 minutes? what are the
all right, it's a tall elevator. Yeah, I think the main things are just the complexities that come with doing this in the EU based on the policy that the EDPB laid out. So as you can see on the screen here, there's a few different categories that are required to be met effectively. It has to be voluntary. Well, that complicates things. How is something that's voluntary actually going to be effective? Because you then require people to participate. Not saying forcing should be what's done, but it raises complexities. It has to be anonymized, or there's a strong focus on anonymization. And that is, as many of you may know already, very complicated in this digital age. To have pure anonymization requires a level of technical sophistication and system separation that in and of itself might be problematic. It's far too easy these days to add data points together and figure out who or where someone is and go from there. From a centralized and decentralized approach, there have to be options for security measures. And again, that relates back to the anonymization and the concept of voluntary. If you have security measures in place that allow for people to make these selections, you are enabling them to have trust in you, which is also important, trying to connect these together, but you are also putting measures in place that add complexity. So if you're going to require a certain degree of security, if you're going to require an encryption, for example, which I know at least one DPI, I believe, has mentioned as an option, which is a fundamental option in the GDPR anyways, these are the types of things that add layers and add complexity. And so while the EU is permitting it, like I said before, they are an example, kind of the inverse of China, as Lydia indicated, that looks more at the different layers of what's needed, stacks them on top of each other, and says basically, here's the entire cake that you have to make in order to put this app forward. And so I think in that instance, there is a lot of facets to it, but at the same time, it is much clearer as to what you have to do than perhaps in some other jurisdictions.
Thank you so much. You did a really good job doing the impossible, Lauren. I know that this is a long conversation and there's a lot of, even at the member state level, different policies. But lucky for us then, technology to the rescue, right? The Silicon Valley, this is an announcement that nobody could have predicted a year ago, right? Google and Apple are partnering to release an API that helps health authorities put in place this kind of tracking technology solutions. It's what we call here in the Silicon Valley frenemies, right? Is that the term? Friends and enemies at the same time. So, talk to us then about this announcement and just, in general, the announcement, and then a little bit how it actually works, how it collects the information that you said, you mentioned before what's required and how the Bluetooth functionality works, all of that nitty-gritty.
So just for clarifying for the audience, I'm speaking for myself as a privacy interested party. I'm not actually involved directly with the contact tracing app, so I'm just going to be covering the publicly announced materials. But at a high level, like what the announcement was Google and Android Google with Android and iOS coming together to have a comprehensive solution for both mobile phone platforms. Both companies like essentially saying if only one platform had tracing, like you can't bridge the gap, right? If an iPhone user walked by an Android user, those two people wouldn't be able to bridge unless we had a more unified solution. And so that was like what the crux of why they partnered together was to provide that unified solve for the primary mobile phone operating systems in the world. And the intent of it was to develop an API framework so that others could build more sophisticated solutions and integrate that into the appropriate like bodies and health officiating groups, rather than Google or Apple do it themselves. And so that was also a conscious choice of both companies in the announcement. And I can go to the next slide.
Work?
Yeah, so using the graphics from the announcement, which are actually quite good, the framing is that you have two individuals, the classic Alice and Bob, which is just an old, all software examples have Alice and Bob, are together for a period of time, and at a later date, perhaps Bob finds out that he has been exposed, or that he actually has been tested positive as having COVID. And the thing that has happened without Alice or Bob taking an action was their phones did a key exchange. So they have a history of seeing each other. And when Bob can indicate to his phone that he has tested positive, his phone can upload the history of his identifiers that he's used. And in phones today, like in the proposal or the solution that Google and Apple have made, rotate their keys. So it's not just like one unique identifier, but it's a collection of rolling identifiers. And so that full set gets uploaded to a centralized server. Meanwhile, though, Alice has no idea any of this has happened. But her phone will pull every now and then a list of, well, in the people in my area, what new IDs have tested positive. And so that's now within the set of Bob plus other people like Bob who submitted that they've tested positive are in that data set for their locality. And her phone can check and see, does my phone have a history of any of these IDs? And if the answer is yes, then you know you've been exposed. And her phone can give her an idea of like, when was that detected? And so she can kind of have an idea. And you could also be kind of clever around if you see it repeatedly, or the number and time lapse of that exposure to give an idea of risk. That's not built into the data set, but that's something you can kind of tease out from having that. The benefit here is it's a local check. It's not a check being done on the server, but it's a check being done on her local phone, at which point then, if that comes back true, you know to isolate, you know to keep tabs on yourself, and to separate from your family or separate from public, and if you weren't wearing a mask for some reason, to definitely be wearing a mask now. So that's like in a nutshell how it works.
So Ben, those keys are kept in your cell phone, right? Unless you test positive. So for Alice, really, none of her information has been uploaded anywhere. It's just that because the information of the person who was found to be positive was uploaded, seeing her telephone is able to identify that she has been exposed. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's like some nuance around, like, do you consider the fact her phone made a request for a particular download? Is that like an exposure of your locality? So there's things in there, and there's some solutions to that. But yeah, in terms of like the actual history of the phone and the keys themselves, they don't need to leave the device unless you voluntarily report yourself as being tested positive.
Lauren, how well does this align with the policies that you were talking to us about, the European one, but also potentially other jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think, it depends, because going to things such as anonymization, when you're following someone's location, that is part of what can become an issue for someone being anonymous. Even if you're able to only trace their data points, you can put together a picture of where someone is. There have been news stories about features on certain technologies that have had issues like this in the past. The benefit here is that the way the keys are processed is localized on the device almost exclusively, as Ben was just explaining. And so that really helps. It also helps that it's not looking at it from the angle of, okay, we're uploading a huge swath of data all in one fell swoop as to all the different places that all of these people have been. It's looking at one person. Now, however, for that one person, you are uploading that data for where that person has been insofar as the relationships that come out of those keys. So it gets back to the security that's related to both how those keys are exchanged in the first place and what protections are in place over those Bluetooth transfers or whatever method is being used to transfer it. And then it's also looking at when you're uploading that data population, who actually has access to it? Are the keys able to be linked and effectively unencrypted such that you could put together a map of where someone is? Or is it effectively a data pool where it's basically just linking random dots and those dots don't actually form a map? And the goal here, as I know Google and Apple have both said very publicly, was to not have something where you could relate it back to a map of where someone is. It's about taking it and making it just dots. And to that end, I think for the EU in particular, which I think most people would agree is the most stringent standard we've seen emerge, it more or less meets those. And I think that's echoed by the fact that multiple state governments in the EU aimed to create their own technology and switched to Google and Apple. They actually tried to go their own way and then went back and said, actually, we're going to go with this common API approach instead because it's better or it's more easier to use or whatever reason was their reason in that place. So I think to that end, it is a very high standard that they've created, and they seem to have really thought through a lot of the different downfalls that can happen from this. It's not foolproof, but I think nowadays you're hard pressed to find anyone who would make a Titanic-esque claim of, oh, there's no possibility anything will go wrong. But from a general policy perspective, it is and has been viewed as one of the, if not the most secure options out there right now.
And we had, I think, two questions we could answer right now. One was, could other IoT devices be used besides phones? Devices in small cities, telephone poles, or buildings? And what of the digital divide, those without phones? I guess I'll take that. Go for it, Lauren.
Oh, sorry, did you say you wanted to take that one?
No, go for it.
Oh, I mean, I think there's the capability for other IoT devices to be used. That's definitely a possibility. I'm sure certain vehicles, for example, easily have that capacity to have the technology linked in there. Again, going back to the question that was asked at the beginning, though, I think that there's a utility aspect to consider. So if you're looking at something that isn't very much tied to a single person, or if you're going to be bouncing data off of places that aren't another person, it opens the question up as to at what point does the data and the practice become useful. There is something to be said that if you, for example, had a Wi-Fi in a small location and it was somehow picking this up, or a pinging device of some type was picking this up for a school classroom, for example, you could have an identification for that room when someone announces that they're sick. But again, that then raises other security and privacy questions. So there's a trade-off there. I think for the most part, thus far, the general perspective I've seen is moving towards one-to-one and not one-to-many. But there is utility to one-to-many. It's just more complicated and not necessarily the same successful output that you would achieve.
Yep.
Ben, I think you said you wanted to take the IoT one.
The other aspect of it is one of the great simplifying things for the technology solution here has been there's just two operating systems and two platforms to develop for with iOS and Android. IoT turns into a myriad of different solutions and technical operating systems. Many IoT devices do have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth that can both be used for this kind of like relative positioning, but because they are spread across all those vendors, it really complicates the solution. And arguably, the more parties you introduce into that, the more like propensity there is for risk or for mistake of implementation. So it's like, it's yes, but it also really affects timing.
Thank you so much. I know that part of the question was about the potential fallbacks of using or downfalls of using the telephone. And we did do a separate webinar, and maybe we can share the link to that webinar with the person who asked that question. One final thing that I was going to say here before we move on to the next slide, I've been doing privacy and data protection for quite a while. I am European myself. I've been living in the US for a long time. But you know, the Google Apple announcement was a surprise. What has also been a surprise to me is how flexible the European data protection authorities have actually been with this whole COVID situation. They went out of the way to explain that this all could be done reasonably, with compliance with GDPR, etc. I actually attended a different webinar when I was a panelist, and a representative of the European Data Protection Supervisor was there, and he was even talking about the possibility of modifying the law if needed. Because obviously this is, we're talking about policy, we're talking about technology, but there's a major event that's going on globally that everybody wants to figure out a way to be helpful and contribute to the solution. So it's been really interesting to see that kind of flexibility from the European side. So let's go on to the next slide.
They had one more live question before we do that, Lydia. The other one was, what about permission from secondary persons who may be standing near me? I may opt in, but they may not. What should be the policy for this?
Right.
So I think
so
go ahead, Lydia.
Okay, just so that we can quickly move on to the next slide. I'm a little concerned about time. I know Lauren has all of the answers, but again, we did a whole webinar that dealt with some of these questions. Obviously, to the extent that this is opt-in, there is going to be a segment of the population that will not be included, and that leads to error potentially or lack of notification. I think it's a question of how much, with the percentage of people that are actually using this technology in a way that it interoperates, right? Like Ben was explaining, these two platforms are able to do now. And depending on the level of adoption, you're going to have a different level of successful outcomes. But it actually dovetails really well with the next slide that's going to explain that this is an opt-in. And I know Lauren already mentioned that from a European perspective, it had to be an opt-in choice. It's not the case, for example, in China, but in the US and the European Union, it is clear that it's going to remain an opt-in possibility. So who creates these apps then?
So the apps largely are being framed as the desire is for health authorities to develop these applications, and both Apple and Google have a set of criteria to ensure that the companies or because it can also be a contractor for a health authority creating this application, that they meet the set of privacy requirements that they've outlined. And if they meet that, then set of privacy requirements and security requirements, and the purposes also align with what Apple and Google have framed, then they can get access to the APIs as well as be published to the store for that. And then the obvious question that's on there is who's been approved? I don't believe that's actually public or published by either company. So it's a great question, but I also don't know.
So will we eventually find out who's using these APIs? It must be a lot of work. So I will think that they will be deployed, right? And used.
Well, I think there are some apps coming out already. I don't want to mention any particular names, but I do believe some are coming out. I just don't know if there's a central listing of what they are. In most cases, a central listing isn't beneficial for people individually. It's highly locality based and potentially related to your healthcare provider if they decide to make an application.
Thank you. So the next question is, there's beyond the fact that these are apps that will be deployed by public authorities. There is a number of other ways in which the public health authorities are going to influence how these apps actually react to identifying positives, identifying exposure. Can you talk to us a little bit about that then?
So, sorry, say that one more time.
How will the COVID positives be identified, and how will the exposure be identified? Are these parameters that are going to be set by Google and Apple, or is there going to be flexibility in terms of what the health authorities decide to count as a positive?
There's a lot of flexibility there. Again, that's partly the way the system's been designed and why there's that review process. You can, depending on the location, you could have it be a doctor has to actually sign off and provide a formal diagnosis as a criteria. It's generally probably not desirable just to give me a button that says I have COVID, that's probably like, lots of weirdness could happen there. So we want to make sure that the signals are the right signals that are being provided, and that a healthcare professional, like that the state is aware of as a certified healthcare professional for this, like is the one providing diagnosis and providing that signal. Otherwise, the system starts to break down. If everybody starts getting these alerts because it's kind of sloppy of who does and who doesn't, it becomes problematic. So that's kind of like the where, depending on the country, depending on the state, if you're talking about even the US, there's obviously very different setups for, like, is it nationalized healthcare? Is it privatized healthcare? Is it a hybrid? And so it's been made to be very flexible for those like different realities, because frankly, like, globally, they're very, very different. And that's why the system's been made so generically, and why there is that review process.
And I think there's another slide on the functioning. Yeah, how about organization? Okay, no, we're moving to the next topic. So before we move to the next topic, Lauren, what is your thought behind this flexibility that the Google Apple API has created? Does it allow for enough granularity so that jurisdictions can ensure that they are complying with their own policies, and at the same time, successfully create a tool to fight the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the flexibility definitely does allow for fitting the needs of the different jurisdictions. I think the complexity that comes into it, though, is with that flexibility, you have to make sure, or at least in a lot of jurisdictions, not necessarily all, that you're giving appropriate notice and that you're making sure people actually understand who's getting the data and what's being done with it. So for example, if data is being collected from your doctor and that then automatically triggers it if you've signed up for this app, that's very different than if you have to go in and say, I authorize for this to be disclosed and understand that this is happening on a one-off basis. Similarly, if you were to, for example, I've heard the idea floated that at government testing sites, you would effectively, you get a little code that links to your test results. Well, they could tie that code to whatever app you're using and just have an automated system there. That is another situation where you would need to make sure people actually understand what they're signing up for, as is legally appropriate, have the ability to opt out if they aren't planning to participate, have the opportunity to opt out possibly on a one-off instance. I mean, in the EU in particular, if you're looking at an opt-in situation of presiding consent, you can reject that at any time. And so there need to be those considerations. The flexibility allows for that to happen in theory, but it is also something that adds complexity, and it adds facets that have to be built out and considered, which adds lag time as well to deploying these technologies.
Thank you. So let's move on to the next question. We've been talking a lot about Google and Apple and this API solution. Obviously, it's not going to work for everybody, right? If you're not a public healthcare authority at this point, you will not get approved to use the API. But there's a need, and in fact, there have been apps that were developed even before the API was made available. So what happens to these organizations or these governmental entities that want to deploy something, and either they can't or they choose not to use the Google Apple API then?
So this is actually one of the questions we got earlier from someone about contact tracing being limited by the device vendor. So here's your answer. So essentially, Android and iOS have both have had APIs for quite some time around Bluetooth scanning and Bluetooth discovery, and so they're a little bit different in terms of the functionality there. iOS tends to have a fairly restrictive background state. And this is just a general truism of the platform, and primarily it helps maintain performance and maintain battery life. And there are background location APIs on the platform, but they cause more battery impact. There's additional user prompts for background location access on iOS, and the frequency is far lower. Also, the moment you walk indoors, the accuracy of that GPS signal can go down because it's an absolute signal as opposed to a relative signal. While Bluetooth, doesn't really care so much whether you're indoors or outdoor, aside from maybe the wall getting in the way. Android has had a bit more flexibility in terms of like apps being able to run in the background and provide so long as there's user awareness that the OS enforces. But even then, like it's a big difference of what an application can do when it's in the foreground like when there's either a foreground service, as the OS calls it, or the app is like screen is on and the app is up, compared to when the app is in the background. And there still is then that more significant battery impact. Some of the things that an OS vendor can do when they're like iOS or Android can do is leverage the hardware that they're running on, leverage the chipset they're running on to do things in a much more efficient fashion. Those are not generally APIs that have been opened up for third parties for very good reasons. That could be a whole talk I could give about OS design methodology. But long story short, there's really good reasons for why the raw underlying hardware is not available and the OS provides an abstraction layer on top. So there's ways to do this, but the benefit of the OS vendor providing is it allows you to have a very tactical solution, taking advantage of the chipsets and hardware itself. It's much more sophisticated than most casual developers would be able to do.
So one question on that is, if you're in this situation, if you're trying to develop an app, whether you're maybe a corporation, and I know Lauren has worked with clients that were, asking these kinds of questions, and so have I. So, but if you're in that situation and you cannot use the API, is there a way to make it interoperable? Meaning, some individuals will be using iOS, some individuals might be using Android. Can you even, this limited functionality, can you make it work across platforms?
Yeah, in general, you would be able to. Like both systems do support Bluetooth Low Energy, which would probably be the solution of choice if I were building something myself. Bit of work to make that happen, but the underlying things are there as long as you're working within the limitations of the platforms.
Thank you, Lauren. And what will be then the advice to these organizations in terms of now you want to develop something independently from these healthcare public entities, and then basically the whole weight of the policy requirements and the law are on you as a private entity. Is this doable? I mean, can an organization realistically comply with all of their obligations in terms of notification, et cetera? Especially if we're talking about employees. We know that the consent from employees is questionable, especially from the European perspective. How do organizations deal with it?
Yeah. So I think, well, this seems like the great moment to remind what Ben reminded earlier, that I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of anyone else. But I think that there are definitely ways to accomplish it. There's technological sophistication that obviously Ben just alluded to, explained outright, that is perhaps not accessible to everyone who wants to do this. What I have seen is a variety of approaches that make sense. Frankly, it makes sense that people are going to have different ways they try to do this. Some are high tech with low tech built in. So perhaps you're using phones, you're developing an app, but you're relying entirely on user entered information. And in that instance, you're again going to be looking at the same considerations from a safeguard and a privacy perspective and a security perspective. Are you using proper technological encryption? Are you using, secure socket layer when you're doing transfers? Are you doing anything to make sure that the data that's entered is verifiable? Is it reliable? Going to what Ben was alluding to earlier, is there anything actually useful about what's being entered? Or are you going to get, excuse me here, but are you going to get someone who's just mad one day and wants to create a scene, or are you going to get someone who's drunk and does something accidentally or purposely, and you end up with a bunch of people being notified of something that's not accurate? So I think there's considerations in there. I've also seen very specific builds that are looking more at a single location consideration. So when you have a workplace, or you have a campus, or you have a localized population where they may go elsewhere, but they're localized to each other in that space, it allows for you to perhaps have different considerations than a broader technology. And again, that might not go all the way to the depth of the API approach and something to that degree. It can, but again, that's a lot of work for a localized space. But you can also have a slightly dulled down version where it's not using the full tech, but it does allow for at least features to be shared and used and leveraged to hopefully have more information. You still have the same issues, and you might be adding liability issues in on top of that, because if you go and notify a ton of people and something happens, whether they all go get tested and they have healthcare costs from that, and it turns out it was a false notification, depending on where you are, that could have implications. So there's different things to consider. I wouldn't recommend anyone go down that path on their own. I would definitely recommend they talk to someone who knows about what matters for the jurisdictions they're considering. But it is possible, I think, to do something at the same technological strength or not, and have utility.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I think we have one last slide, but before we talk about it, I know we started late, and I wanted to ask both of you, Ben and Lauren, do you have something coming up immediately that you have to disconnect? Ben, okay. So Ben, let's take advantage of your time because you are almost there. We talked about open source. Lauren mentioned open source as one of the things that the EU is talking about, but there's more than open source here, right? If you really want to make this reliable, can you explain to us a little bit at a high level, what is the concept of open source and why is it not enough and what else will we need?
So these are things not so much even just about DCTT, but just in general, if you're considering like security or privacy properties of anything you might use. And these are the things I look for personally. And this is kind of a question that was asked earlier about big tech. So this is you can consider this me addressing the question as best I can. The open source, it helps people understand like what's happening, how has it been developed, what are the properties in the systems, like having that transparency not just written in a white paper but provided in code. The next piece though is how do you know that is the code actually running on a server or the code running on a phone? And there's a few techniques for that, but one that's picking up a bit of steam is the idea of binary transparency, where you have a mathematical way to verify that this open source code is the actual code running on a device, and you have a way to attest to that. And so that gives you like a much stronger feeling that there hasn't been a modification somewhere along the way between the code being written and the compilation and distribution of that code to a particular device. And then the last one is seeing in terms of the implementation. Are they using techniques like computational encryption? The key property of that as a difference is you can do things like joins between two sets, like my history and say Lydia's history. And I don't have to expose my information to Lydia in order to do a join to see if we have commonality. Those are really interesting properties. These things are actually kind of new in the technology space. They have existed prior to COVID, but they're the things that I really look for in any service that I would use. Are they hitting these notes or not? Really high bars, but they're also like the things that I would love to see as an industry us adopting. And with that, I got to run to a meeting, but hopefully everybody found this very useful.
Thank you. Feel free to disconnect and let's move it. Maddie, I know
the slides will disappear with me though, so goodbye.
Okay.
Good.
Perfect.
Very good.
Lauren, Lydia, thank you so much for speaking today and for your patience this morning. And to all of our attendees, thank you again so much for your patience. Rest assured that I am doing a deep investigation as to what happened and making sure that never happens again. We've done 18 events so far, so that was a wild ride, and we really appreciate you hanging in there with us, and we're going to make sure that we continue to bring you great events. We've dropped the one we have next week on the Legends of Technology with Joel Birnbaum, which is going to be an incredible event. We really hope you're going to join us. Don't worry, it will get started on time. There won't be any issues. So thank you again all for your patience, and a special thank you to our speakers, Lauren and Lydia and Ben, who just had to drop off.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you. I know Ben left, but thank you, Lydia, for moderating this, and Lauren for joining us, and Maddie for your patience in getting it all together. Thank you.
And all this will be available online as well, and we will be sending this out to individuals. And if you had any friends that weren't able to join on or were frustrated with getting logged on, feel free to share that link with them too. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.